Welcome back to Tabletop Glory. Last time we were talking about making terrain out of old CDs. In today's episode, I want to talk about upgrading existing terrain. Now that can either be terrain that you have made or terrain that you have purchased. Maybe you're not quite happy with what you've got and you want to make some upgrades to what you have and either turn it into something brand new or just make it a better version of what you've got. Now, I'm going to be doing things a little bit differently than what we typically do. I'm probably going to be imposing a lot of photos over me talking just so you can get a better understanding of what I'm trying to convey. Starting off with, I have two bunkers of similar construction. They were initially created using two foam core boards, like what you would use for a poster for like a science fair. And then glued together to create these thicker concrete walls. The gentleman who commissioned this bunker gave very specific instructions, and unfortunately, the final construction of this does not really match up with what he wanted. So he's sent it to me to try and fix things. Now, I want to start this out by saying these don't really need to be fixed. They kind of serve their purpose. You can put units in here. They still provide half cover on the back window. They don't really fit through the door, but they don't need to because it's an open roof. He did want a real looking wooden floor in both bunkers, which he did not get. And he wanted the ability for these to be able to be used as a water pump station for additional terrain, so that they could be used as like an objective type thing. He plays a lot of kill team style games. I'm going to try to make the water pump stuff removable so that this can be used as a standard bunker or as an objective. I'm going to be creating a roof to go over top of these that will simply sit in place and will have a lip on the inside that will stop it from getting knocked off on accident. In addition to that, we're going to extend the edge of the bunker probably about another inch off of the wall, not necessarily the original base. And the reason for that is in a lot of games, especially when you start talking about tournament play, usually the cover indicators are an inch off of the wall, meaning that if you are within an inch of the wall and line of sight and yada yada, you're still in cover. So I want to go ahead and make this at least an inch all the way around to ensure that that cover measurement is easier to tell. We're going to be adding some lines to the sides of the bunker all the way around to look like poured concrete. In World War II, a lot of bunkers, especially German bunkers, were done in levels, and like a foot or 2 feet worth of concrete were poured at a time using molds. And you can really see those layer lines along the side, almost kind of reminiscent of 3D printing. So we're going to be adding those back in. I'm also going to be adding some propaganda posters around both the inside and the outside on both bunkers for various different subjects, so that way no matter what game these are played with, they'll kind of always go with what's available. We're also going to go through, and anywhere where there's these noticeable edges or things not quite lining up right, I'm going to go ahead and use a little bit of filler, probably a wall spackle, to kind of flatten things out and smooth things out and just give it a nicer finish. And we're also going to try and add a bit of a texture to the outside and the inside to give it more of that concrete look. Whereas right now you can see a lot of the brush strokes. So we'll probably be going in either with sponge or we'll glue some grit. I haven't really decided to the outside to give it just a bit of texture. Probably we'll do it with a sponge first and then see how that looks. first things first, we need to go ahead and remove the existing flooring, and we need to try and smooth things out as best as we can. Now, I know this isn't going to be perfect, but it just needs to be good enough. Now, I do know I said I was going to use wall spackle originally, and I do still stand by that. However, I was out of wall spackle. What little I had left was pretty much dried up in the container, so I decided to just go ahead and use some Bondo. Now, what's really incredibly important to keep in mind is that Bondo is acetone based, and because this was already sealed with tons of layers of paint and everything, I really didn't need to worry about anything. And unfortunately, this resulted in me not really thinking about things later, and while I was trying to fix a minor problem I created when I was working on the roof tiles, I didn't think to seal things, and I just went ahead and hit it with some Bondo. And well, it might be just a little hard to tell here, but this entire edge has caved in. The acetone has eaten into the foam, and although I could seal this and just add more Bondo and solve my problem, it would result in this entire end of the structure just being significantly heavier, probably than the entire build itself. And that's no good for a customer. For me, I wouldn't care. I would seal this and go ahead and fill it with Bondo and just be done with it. But lesson learned the hard way. We're just going to go ahead and cut out another one of these and just call it a day. Speaking of the roof tiles, how did I make them? Well, first we got to go ahead and measure. But we're not just going to measure from the outside to the outside. We also have to measure from the inside to the inside in order to make that key that I was speaking about earlier in the video, where I want things to kind of lock into place instead of just loosely sitting on top of everything. Now, you could get fancy with this, I suppose, and you could drill some holes in the corner of the bunker and in the corner of the roof lid and add some magnets, but you shouldn't always put magnets in for the sake of putting magnets. Sometimes just doing things the old school way is a lot easier. Once I know where the keys need to end up, we need to cut those out. So I'm just going to use some scrap foam and I'm going to cut some nice thin strips. These are going to get glued approximately the distance of the thickness of the walls. In other words, regardless of what materials you've made the walls of your bunker out of, you need to make sure that you're going to glue these keys at least that distance in from the outside edge of whatever your roof tile is going to be made out of. I wanted to add a little bit of a tapered edge to the roof of these tiles, so I'm measuring about 1/2 inch in from the outside edge, and I'm just going to go ahead and mark that off with a square to give myself a rough guideline. Now, I also don't want this taper to go all the way down to the edge, but I do want it to be close, and it doesn't need to be perfect as these bunkers are going to be quite old, so we're going to be able to decorate things up with a lot of weathering and things like that, and we're going to really be able to hide both the imperfections, but also in some cases, we're going to be able to use those imperfections to also sell the age of the bunker. So again, these things don't need to be super perfect, but they do need to be relatively consistent around all 4 edges. Now, if you have a Proxon, doing something like this perfect every time is going to be a lot easier, but if you don't have a Proxon, I have found the best way so far is to simply go ahead and hold things as steady as you can, take off a slice from your corner just to remove some material so that the foam can flex a little bit when you make your final cut, and you'll be able to get a much more consistent finish on the second cut. So here you can see me kind of sponging on what appears to be a gray paint. This is actually gesso with a little bit of black paint mixed in. Now, gesso is a really thick paint. It's really great for hiding mistakes. It's really great for smoothing out surfaces and things like that. It's not quite Bondo levels of smooth things over, but it's really nice. It's really great for making texture as well. So you can see me here, I'm just kind of stippling it on using this sea sponge. Now, if you don't have a sponge, you can just use an old brush, anything that's kind of flared out and has some texture to it. And we're going to want to build this up over time, maybe using 2 or 3 different layers of gray. You might want to go ahead and do a base coat all over everything so that any kind of mismatched colors from underneath don't really show through. In my case, I'm going to be putting on so much paint that doesn't really matter. Very little of this red's going to show through. And I plan to do some washes over some places toward the end anyway, which is really going to help blend all this together anyhow. So just kind of build this up over time, maybe do 2 or 3 layers, and do keep in mind that gesso does take longer to cure and dry than regular paint does. So this is a process that's going to take a little bit of time, but the effect is more than worth it. Now you should be left with this. So this is a really, really bright gray. If you've ended up with a darker gray, don't worry about that. If you have a little bit of pin showing through, if you were using a pen to mark all of your foam like I did, you can just go in with a little bit of gray paint and just kind of dab at it and kind of blend it all in. It's okay if a little bit of ink is still showing through. Now, we have 2 options here. I said I wanted to do some horizontal marks on the walls of the bunker. Now, I've done this bright enough that I'm going to want to darken this concrete look before I add my horizontal marks. But if you've ended up with a much darker gray than I have, you may want to go ahead and do the horizontal marks now and then do a black wash over top of everything. Just know that the brighter these gray marks we're about to add, the more it's going to look like scrapes and scratches. So I'm going to be applying my black wash using an airbrush, but you can just heavily water down a black wash and apply it in a vertical motion. But I'm going to apply mine with an airbrush so I have a little bit more control. But I'm also going to occasionally take a wet, damp brush and I'm going to add those vertical brush strokes in order to make it look like how the natural weathering of water would have caused it to seep and run down the side of my bunker. You'll see a little bit more of that here in the high speed in just a minute, but I wanted to try and explain that to you before I did it on camera so that it's a little bit more obvious as to what you're watching. Now I made some guidelines that are about 1 centimeter apart, and that is because the walls are roughly about 4 centimeters tall. And these are going to be these horizontal markings that we saw in our original photo that I showed of the German bunker. Now, I could have done this after the wash, and I do reinforce this after the wash, but here I'm just using some white chalk pastel, and I'm looking for sharp edges to try to keep my lines as thin as possible. I end up going with a little bit thicker than what you can see me doing in the beginning there, but ultimately I do end up needing to reinforce these once all is said and done, because the wash process does wipe some of this away. Even though I did seal it, that chalk pastel did still rub off a little bit in this next step. Now, using a heavily diluted black wash, you could apply this with a brush, but just lightly spraying it on with an airbrush and then doing a upward flicking motion with my brush is just going to leave some vertical striations, basically just lines that are vertical, and these are going to simulate the way that water would run down off the roof. Now, I will need to do a little bit more reinforcing of this when I put my roof coverings on. I'm going to need to kind of blend everything together. So I'll be going back over this lightly a little bit again later, but I just wanted to show you the process so that when you see everything all said and done, you'll have a better understanding of how I was able to accomplish this technique. Moving on, we're going to be working on the floor. Now, the original person used coffee stir sticks. Now, I would recommend roughing up one side with a wire brush if you want to use coffee stir sticks. Personally, I'm going to be using thin slices of foam, and I'm going to cut them down roughly to the same diameter. What that's going to do is it's going to allow me to have some slightly different textures, some slightly different sizes. It's going to really break it up and look a bit more like wooden planks. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use a wire brush to rough up one of the sides of the styrofoam. Now, it is easy to go a little overboard when using styrofoam, and it can start to look a little bit cartoonish if you're not careful. But nonetheless, I've done this a lot, so I kind of know it's a bit of a trial and error if you're doing this for the first time. In any case, I'm not going to show myself cutting up all that styrofoam. I've actually done a video where I made an entire house out of foam, and there's plenty of shots of me doing what I'm about to do in that video, and if I can remember, I will link that video here. But in any case, I'm going to go ahead and put on a podcast and get all this stuff cut out, and we'll jump cut back when I'm ready to paint the floors. Real quick, I wanted to add that I was putting some black 3.0 down underneath the foam strips. I just did this in case any of that underside showed through. I just wanted to kind of like mask everything that was down there. And then I went ahead and mixed up a brown wash just to kind of save a little bit of product, so I wasn't using tons of Citadel paints to paint all of the brown. And I was really happy with how the blue-gray that I chose to base coat everything mixed with that brown and kind of gave it this aged appearance. Alright, one of the last steps we have here for the bunker rehabilitation project is how to extend the base by 1 inch. Now, if this was just for me, I would cut a 2-inch strip out of a really thin piece of foam, and I would glue it down with a 1-inch overhang, and then I would blend everything in using some kind of basing texture. However, this is for a commission and I need this to survive shipping, so my next best option is to take a much larger piece of foam that's got about a 1/2 inch in thickness, and we're going to cut out the size of the bunker itself. So that was the plan until I got a better look at things after I cut out the material. As you can see, there's really not a lot of space for me to blend things in. If I owned a Proxxon, I would have just sliced these layers in half and still stuck with the plan, but due to the limitations of what I have available to me, the plan to add a bigger base just isn't as feasible anymore. Now, I could go get some more MDF or something like that and cut that out, but I'm a little scrapped for time, so it's just gonna have to be what it is. Okay, now due to time constraints, due to sickness and things like that, I'm gonna have to dial this project back a little bit. This has been going on long enough, but honestly, this is so much better than it was. One of the last things I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to try and cover up some of the overbrushing that was created when I was fixing the walls. And I'm just going to be using 2 different colors of brown, one that's significantly darker and one that's significantly brighter. The exact colors I'm using really don't matter because I'm going to be applying them to the surface wet so that they kind of blend together as I go along. And 3 weeks later, here we have it. Yeah, I know this project shouldn't have taken 3 weeks, but again, I've been sick, so we do the best we can, right? I haven't put any kind of color around the edge yet. I'm not sure if the client wants me to do brown to match the ground color, or if they want me to do a black rim around the base, so I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But here you can see it with the lid on. Is it airtight, so to speak? No, but it looks just fine. I think it looks really wonderful, especially compared to what we started with. As you can see here, it works really great for both Firstborn Space Marines as well as for Primaris Marines. I don't think you'd really be able to fit a Terminator in here, at least with the lid on. But also you can see my little insert in here that's meant to be like the water treatment-y type facility. This is just meant to be like a stand-in to kind of alter the model in a visual way so that it represents something more than just a bunker, whether that be like a chemical plant or a water treatment or whatever. And as you can see, with all the models in here and even with the water treatment in here, the lid still fits on pretty much the exact same it did without any of the models in there. And I'm pretty happy with this. Now, if I wanted to go ahead and spice things up a little bit, I could put some propaganda posters on the wall, which you could just print out and apply with Mod Podge or even just white PVA glue. If you really want to get fancy, you can make some water slide transfers, but honestly, just cutting out the paper and gluing it on looks a lot better in my opinion. It gives the paper a bit of heft. Lots of little scratches could be added, or dry brushing to the floor, or things like that. It just depends upon how much detail you really want to take this. The client that I'm doing this for really isn't interested in a ton of detail, and I honestly think that there's plenty of detail on there, in fact more so than what the client was probably expecting. I'm really happy with how it turned out, especially compared to what it looked like in the beginning, and I hope that you guys can at least take away from this that just because you've made something doesn't mean you can't upgrade it and continue to use it or be more proud of it. I know sometimes as our skills kind of evolve, there's almost like this like shame or stigmatism behind our old projects, and we don't want to show them to people anymore, or we strip them down and use them for parts. But honestly, there's no shame in where we've come from, and with a little bit of work you can just upgrade it into something that you can be proud to show off again. In any case, I've been Graham Johnson, this was Tabletop Glory, and as always, may your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.